Stop calling, I'm in a meeting, my husband snapped. But at that moment I was standing in front of the hotel, watching him walk in with his mistress. A little later the receptionist handed him an envelope. He rushed home, and his face went pale. I didn't call him again. Not because I was afraid of his temper. David had never frightened me, not really, but because I didn't need to. In that moment, standing beneath the polished brass canopy of the Hilton Garden Inn off Route 17, everything I needed to know had already unfolded in front of me, slow and precise, like a scene I had somehow rehearsed, without realizing it. The air smelled faintly of citrus and disinfectant, the automatic doors opening and closing in measured sighs behind me, as guests passed in and out. Business travelers, a couple with suitcases, a man on his phone speaking too loudly about quarterly numbers. Ordinary life, predictable, safe. Except for what I had just seen. David, my husband of 15 years, had stepped out of a rideshare car and paused just long enough to adjust his jacket, glancing around not nervously, not exactly, but carefully. Then she appeared from the other side of the entrance. Younger. Not dramatically so, but enough. Early 30s, maybe. Dark hair, sleek, deliberate. She didn't hesitate. She walked straight up to him, close enough that their shoulders touched before either of them spoke. And then they went inside together. No distance, no pretense. No meeting. I remember noticing something small, almost absurd in its detail, the way his hand brushed lightly against the small of her back as the doors slid open. It wasn't even intimate in a dramatic sense, it was practiced. Familiar. The kind of gesture that doesn't ask permission. I stood there longer than I should have, my phone still in my hand, the screen dimming and lighting again, as if waiting for me to decide what version of reality I was willing to accept. For a long time I had told myself that marriage, real marriage, not the kind people post about online, was built on patience, on the quiet work of understanding another person over years. David and I had built something steady. Not perfect, but stable. We had routines, shared accounts. A house in a quiet neighborhood outside Dallas. Weekends that followed a pattern so predictable I could map them out months in advance. Predictability I had always believed was a form of trust. Now standing in front of that hotel, I realized something else. It was also a form of blindness. I stepped inside. The lobby was cool, softly lit, the kind of neutral decor designed to offend no one and impress no one either. A front desk stretched along the far wall behind it. A young woman in a navy blazer smiled politely at a man checking out. To my right, a seating area with low chairs and a coffee table scattered with magazines. No sign of David. Of course not. They wouldn't linger. I didn't walk up to the desk right away. Instead, I took a seat, crossed my legs, and placed my phone face down on the table. I let myself breathe slowly, deliberately, because I knew that whatever I did next would matter more than anything I might say in anger. There are moments when your life shifts not loudly, not with drama, but with a quiet, irreversible clarity. This was one of them. I thought back over the past few months. The late evenings, the sudden client dinners, the way he had started keeping his phone face down, always within reach. The small irritations I had dismissed because they didn't fit the version of him I had built over years. And then there were the finances. That part surfaced more slowly, like something my mind had been avoiding. A few weeks ago, I had noticed a charge on our joint credit card that didn't quite make sense. Nothing alarming, just unfamiliar. A boutique hotel in the city. He had explained it away easily, something about a last-minute booking when a meeting ran late. I hadn't questioned it. Now sitting there in that lobby, I understood how easily trust can be repurposed into something else, something convenient. I stood up and walked to the front desk. "Hi," I said, keeping my voice even. "I'm trying to confirm a reservation. My husband may have checked in a little earlier." The receptionist smiled, professional, guarded. "I can certainly try to help, ma'am. Do you have a name?" "David Carter." She typed for a moment, then paused. There it was, that subtle shift. Not alarm, not suspicion, just recognition. "I'm sorry," she said carefully, "I can't share guest information without proper authorization." "Of course." I nodded as if I had expected nothing else. "I understand." And I did. This wasn't going to be solved with confrontation at a front desk. It wasn't going to be resolved by catching him in a hallway or forcing a scene in a place designed for anonymity. This required something else. Something quieter. I stepped away from the desk and walked back outside. The late afternoon sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the parking lot. I leaned against my car for a moment, letting the reality settle, not as a shock, but as a structure I needed to understand before I could dismantle it. Because that was the truth I hadn't fully admitted yet. This wasn't just about betrayal. It was about what came after. I didn't drive home right away. Instead, I opened my phone and pulled up our banking app. Joint accounts, savings, credit lines, everything we had built together documented in neat rows of numbers and transactions. I scrolled slowly, and there it was again. The hotel charges weren't isolated. They formed a pattern: different dates, different locations, but all within a certain radius. Consistent, repeated, intentional. My stomach didn't drop. It settled. Because now, for the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was seeing. I closed the app and stared at the blank reflection on my phone screen, catching a glimpse of my own expression, calm, composed, almost detached. 15 years. That's how long it had taken to build this life. And in less than 10 minutes standing in front of a hotel, I had seen exactly how it could unravel. But I wasn't going to let it unravel on his terms. I got into my car, started the engine, and sat there for a moment longer before pulling out of the lot. I didn't go home. Not yet. Instead, I drove in the opposite direction toward a part of town I hadn't visited in years, where quiet office buildings sat behind manicured lawns and discreet signage. Places where decisions were made carefully, documented properly, and executed without noise. I parked, turned off the engine, and took a breath. Because if there was one thing I understood now, it was this. What I had seen today wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of something else. And this time, I was going to be the one in control. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was heartbroken, at least not in the way people imagine, but because my mind refused to stay still. It kept moving, organizing, connecting things I had overlooked for months, maybe longer. Small details I had filed away as coincidence, now returning with a different weight. By morning, I wasn't asking if something was wrong. I was asking how much. David left early as usual. He kissed my cheek in the kitchen, a quick practice gesture, his hand already reaching for his keys. "Big day," he said, grabbing a travel mug. "Back-to-back meetings." I nodded, watching him carefully this time, not suspiciously, not accusingly, but with a kind of quiet attention I hadn't used before. It was remarkable how easy it was to miss things when you believed you didn't need to look. "Long day?" I asked. "Yeah," he said, already halfway to the door. "Probably won't be back until late." The door closed behind him. And just like that, the performance ended. I waited exactly 10 minutes before moving. Not because I was afraid he might come back, but because I needed to feel the space settle, needed to shift from the role I had been playing for years into something more deliberate. I cleared the kitchen, slowly rinsing the coffee cups, wiping the counter, moving through familiar motions while my mind worked ahead of me. Then I went upstairs. David's office was at the end of the hallway, a room we rarely used for anything but storage and occasional work calls. He kept it neat, almost aggressively, so files-aligned drawers closed everything in its place. It had always struck me as a sign of discipline. Now it felt more like control. I sat at his desk and opened the top drawer. Nothing unusual: pens, a notepad, a few business cards. The second drawer held older files, tax returns, insurance documents, things we had both reviewed at some point. But the third drawer was locked. That in itself wasn't suspicious. People lock things. But I had never seen him lock anything in this house before. I stood up, stepped back, and considered it not emotionally, but practically. Whatever was in there mattered enough for him to secure it. And if I was going to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with, I needed more than guesses. I didn't try to force it open. Instead, I went back downstairs, picked up my phone, and called the bank. "Hi," I said, keeping my tone steady. "I'd like to review some recent transactions on our joint account." The representative was polite, efficient. We went through the usual verification, and within minutes, I had access to more detailed records than the app provided. I took notes as we spoke. Dates, locations, amounts, patterns. The hotel I had seen yesterday wasn't an isolated incident. There were at least 6 different charges over the past 3 months, all in similar ranges, all at mid-tier business hotels within driving distance. Not extravagant, not reckless, just careful enough to avoid attention. Except attention was exactly what they deserved. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" the representative asked. "Yes," I said after a pause. "I'd like copies of these statements emailed to me." "Of course." I ended the call and sat there for a moment staring at the numbers I had written down. They weren't devastating, not in a financial sense, but they told a story. One that ran parallel to the life I thought I was living. And then there was something else. A transfer. 2 weeks ago, a significant amount had been moved from our joint savings into an account I didn't immediately recognize. Not large enough to trigger alarms, but large enough to matter. "David," I said quietly to the empty room, testing the name as if it belonged to someone else. I opened my laptop and logged into our shared financial portal. The transfer was there just as the representative had described. Destination, a separate account under his name. An individual account. He had opened it recently. That changed things. Because this wasn't just about secrecy. It was about planning. I leaned back in my chair, letting the pieces settle into place. The hotels, the late nights, the separate account. Each one could be explained on its own just barely, but together they formed something else entirely. Intent. And intent, unlike emotion, leaves a trail. I closed the laptop and sat there for a long moment considering my next move. There was a version of this story where I confronted him immediately, threw the evidence on the table, demanded explanations, forced everything into the open. But that version relied on his honesty, and I no longer trusted that. No, if I was going to do this, it had to be done differently. Carefully. I picked up my phone again and scrolled to a number I hadn't called in years. "Linda," I said when she answered. "Emily." Her voice carried a note of surprise. "It's been a while." "It has," I agreed. "Are you still with the firm?" "Of course," she said. "Why?" I hesitated just long enough to choose my words. "I need to understand my options," I said. "Legally." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, not uncomfortable, but knowing. "Come by this afternoon," she said finally. "We'll talk." The office was exactly as I remembered, quiet, understated, efficient. Law firms, especially good ones, rarely needed to impress you visually. Their value was in what they knew and how they used it. Linda greeted me personally, ushering me into her office with a professionalism that softened slightly once the door closed. "All right," she said, taking a seat across from me. "Tell me what's going on." I did. Not everything, not the emotional weight of it, but the facts. The hotel, the transactions, the separate account, the pattern. She listened without interrupting, her expression focused, analytical. When I finished, she leaned back slightly. "Do you have proof?" she asked. "Some," I said. "Not everything." "That's fine," she replied. "You don't need everything yet. You need enough." "Enough for what?" "Control," she said simply. The word settled between us. "Here's what matters," she continued. "You're dealing with 2 issues, infidelity and financial activity. The first is emotional. The second is legal. And in situations like this, the second one is what determines outcomes." I nodded. "What do I do?" I asked. "You don't confront him," she said immediately. "Not yet. You gather. You document. You understand exactly what you're dealing with before you make any moves. And the account, I asked. We'll look into it, she said. If funds were moved improperly, that becomes important. Very important. I exhaled slowly. For the first time since standing outside that hotel, I felt something shift. Not relief. Not exactly, but direction. This isn't about catching him, Linda said, as if reading my thoughts. It's about positioning yourself. Position. It was a different way of thinking about everything that had happened. Not as a betrayal to react to, but as a situation to manage. I stood up to leave and Linda handed me a folder. Start here, she said. And Emily. I paused. Don't underestimate how much you don't know yet. She was right. Because as I walked back to my car, one thought stayed with me sharper than the rest. If David had gone this far, then there was more. Linda was right about one thing I didn't know enough yet. But I knew where to look. The next 48 hours unfolded with a kind of quiet precision I didn't recognize in myself before. I moved through my routine as usual, coffee in the morning, a brief exchange with David in the kitchen, the same measured calm in my voice, but beneath it everything had shifted. Every word, every glance, every silence. I was paying attention now. And when you start paying attention, patterns don't just appear. They sharpen. David's schedule, for instance, was almost too predictable once I stopped taking it at face value. The late meetings clustered around certain days, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and always within the same time window. The hotel charges aligned with those days. The separate account showed transfers just before them. It wasn't chaotic. It was structured, which meant it could be mapped. On Thursday afternoon, I drove back to the hotel. Not impulsively, not emotionally. This time, I went in with a plan. The same receptionist was behind the desk, though now she looked tired, the end of a long shift settling into her posture. She glanced up as I approached, her expression polite but distant, someone who had already spoken to too many people that day. Hi, I said, offering a small measured smile. I was here a couple of days ago. She hesitated for just a moment, then nodded slightly. Yes, I remember. I need your help, I said, keeping my tone calm, not demanding, not desperate. And I understand you have rules. That part mattered. People respond differently when you acknowledge their boundaries before asking them to bend them. She straightened a little. What kind of help? I placed a sealed envelope on the counter, not sliding it toward her, not pushing it forward, just letting it sit there between us. I don't need information, I said. I don't need confirmation. I just need this to be handed to my husband when he checks out. Her eyes dropped to the envelope, then back to me. I can't guarantee. I understand, I interrupted gently. But if he checks out tomorrow morning, and he will, this will make sense. That was a risk. But it wasn't a guess. I had already seen the pattern. She looked at me for a long moment, weighing something I couldn't quite see. What's his name? She asked finally. David Carter. She hesitated again, then reached for the envelope. I can leave it with his room number, she said carefully, but I can't confirm anything beyond that. That's enough, I replied. And it was. Because the envelope wasn't about confrontation. It was about timing. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I drove a few blocks away and parked where I could see the hotel entrance from a distance, not close enough to draw attention, but close enough to watch. Waiting is a strange thing. It stretches time in ways you don't expect, pulling minutes into something heavier, more deliberate. I sat there for nearly an hour, the engine off, the late afternoon light fading slowly into early evening. And then I saw him. David stepped out of the same rideshare service, dressed differently this time, more casual, less deliberate, but the outcome was the same. She met him at the entrance again. No hesitation, no distance. They went inside together. I didn't feel anything sharp. No surge of anger, no sudden urge to confront. Just confirmation. I started the car and drove away. The envelope itself had taken less time to prepare than I expected. Inside, I placed 3 things. First copies of the financial statements highlighted organized, impossible to misinterpret. The hotel charges, the transfers, the separate account. Second, a printed consultation summary from Linda's firm, not a formal filing, not yet, but enough to make one thing clear. This was no longer private. And third, a single sheet of paper. No paragraphs, no accusations. Just one sentence. I know everything, and I'm done protecting you. I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. The next morning, I woke up before David. I moved through the house quietly, making coffee, letting the routine settle into place again. When he came downstairs, he looked exactly the same as always, calm, composed, unaware. "Morning," he said, pouring himself a cup. "Morning," I replied. No tension. No indication that anything had changed. Because for him it hadn't. Not yet. He left around 8, the same way he always did, keys in hand, a quick nod, the door closing behind him with a familiar, ordinary sound. I waited 5 minutes. Then I picked up my phone. The call came sooner than I expected. It was just after 9. David's name flashed on the screen. I let it ring once. Twice. 3 times. Then I answered. "Hello," I said, my voice steady. There was a pause on the other end, long enough that I could hear his breathing, uneven, not quite controlled. "Emily," he said. "Just my name. Nothing else." I didn't respond right away. "What is this?" he asked finally. There it was. Not anger. Not denial. Confusion. "Check the envelope again," I said quietly. Another pause. "I don't understand," he said. And for the first time since all of this began, I almost smiled. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? He didn't understand. Not yet. "You will," I replied. Then I hung up. He came home less than 20 minutes later. Faster than I expected. The front door opened hard, not violently, but with urgency. His footsteps were quick, uneven, moving through the house with a kind of tension I had never seen in him before. I stayed in the kitchen. When he appeared in the doorway, the envelope was still in his hand, slightly crumpled now, the edges no longer neat. And his face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even fear. It was something closer to realization. "You went through my accounts?" he asked. Not, "Did you see her?" Not, "What is this about?" That was his first question. I tilted my head slightly. "Is that what concerns you?" I asked. He stared at me, searching for something, an opening, a weakness, a version of this conversation he could control. But that version didn't exist anymore. "You don't understand," he said quickly. "It's not what it looks like." There it was. The script. I had expected it. Prepared for it. And dismissed it before he even spoke. "Then explain it," I said calmly. He opened his mouth, closed it again. Because explanations require coherence. And lies once exposed rarely have that. The silence stretched between us. Heavy. Unavoidable. And in that silence, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. Because for the first time in our marriage, David wasn't the one controlling the narrative. I was. He took a step forward. "Emily," he said, softer now, "we need to talk." I nodded slightly. "Yes," I said. "We do." And this time, I was ready. We stood there for a long moment, facing each other across the kitchen, two people who had shared 15 years of life, now separated by something neither of us could pretend away anymore. David was the first to move. He set the envelope down on the counter, smoothing it instinctively, as if restoring its shape might somehow restore control. "Emily," he said again, slower this time, choosing his tone carefully. "You're jumping to conclusions." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. "I'm not jumping anywhere," I replied. "I followed a pattern. And it led me exactly where it was supposed to." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't what you think it is." "Then say what it is," I said, still calm. Another pause. Another calculation. Because now he had to decide which version of the truth he could afford to tell. "It's complicated," he said finally. "No," I replied, meeting his eyes. "It's not. That was the first moment he looked unsettled, not by what I knew, but by how I was responding. There was no anger to deflect, no emotional surge to manage, just clarity. And clarity leaves very little room to hide. "You went through my accounts," he said again, returning to the point that mattered most to him. "I reviewed our finances," I corrected. "The ones with my name on them." "That money is still ours," he said quickly. "For now," I said. The words landed harder than I intended, but I didn't take them back. He stared at me, trying to measure how far this had gone, how much of the situation was still recoverable. "Emily, we can fix this," he said, his voice softening into something almost familiar. "We've been through worse." I thought about that. The years we had built together. The small arguments, the reconciliations, the quiet understanding that comes from long-term partnership. There had been difficulties, yes, but they had always existed within the same structure. This was different. "This isn't something that broke," I said. "This is something you built." He flinched. Just slightly. But enough. "I made mistakes," he said, shifting his approach. "I admit that. But it doesn't mean everything is over." "Mistakes happen," once I replied. "Patterns happen by choice." The silence that followed wasn't loud. It was final. We moved to the living room not because it made the conversation easier, but because it gave us space, physical distance to match what had already formed between us. David sat down first, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "Okay," he said, as if resetting the conversation. "Let's just talk about this rationally." I remained standing for a moment, then took a seat across from him. "Go ahead," I said. He nodded, as if grateful for the permission. "The account you're making, it sounds worse than it is. I needed flexibility for some investments, and it was easier to separate certain funds." "Without telling me," I said. "It wasn't intentional," he replied quickly. Things moved faster than I expected." I watched him carefully. The words were structured, but the logic wasn't. "And the hotels?" I asked. He hesitated. "Longer this time." "That," he started, then stopped. "That's separate." "Is it?" Another silence. "I didn't plan for any of this," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "It just happened." There it was. The version of events that reduces deliberate actions into accidents. "I don't believe you," I said. The statement wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Because belief once withdrawn doesn't come back easily. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, his shoulders dropping slightly, as if something inside him had shifted from resistance to calculation. "What do you want?" he asked. It was a different question. A practical one. And for the first time, we were having the same conversation. "I want clarity," I said, "and I want control over what happens next." "You have that," he replied. "We can work this out." "No," I said, shaking my head slightly. "We can't." He stared at me. Not angry, not defensive, just uncertain. "I spoke to an attorney yesterday," I continued. That changed everything. The air in the room shifted instantly, not dramatically, but definitively. Whatever assumptions he had been operating under about reconciliation, about negotiation, about control, they no longer applied. "You did what he asked." "I got information," I said. "That's all." His expression tightened. "Emily, that's not necessary. We don't need to involve." "It already is," I interrupted. Another pause. This one heavier. "Are you serious?" he asked. "Yes." The simplicity of the answer left no room for interpretation. The next few days unfolded in a way that felt both surreal and entirely logical. David moved through the house carefully, as if every step might trigger something unpredictable. His calls were quieter. His phone was no longer left unattended. The casual familiarity that had once defined our interactions was replaced with something more measured, something cautious. He tried occasionally to return to normal. Small conversations, routine questions, the illusion of continuity. I responded when necessary. But I didn't engage. Because engagement implies a shared future. And that was no longer certain. A week later, we met with Linda. David arrived tense but composed, his demeanor shifting into something more formal as soon as we entered the office. This was his environment: contracts, negotiations, structured conversations. He understood these rules. Or thought he did. Linda was professional, direct, and most importantly, unimpressed. She laid out the facts clearly. The financial records. The transfers. The obligations tied to our shared assets. Nothing exaggerated. Nothing emotional. Just reality. David listened, his expression tightening slightly with each point. When she finished, he sat back, exhaling slowly. "This is unnecessary," he said. "We can settle this privately." Linda didn't respond immediately. She glanced at me, then back at him. "That depends," she said calmly, "on what your definition of settle is." He hesitated. Because now, for the first time, the situation wasn't abstract. It had structure. Consequences. "You're overcomplicating this," he said finally, his tone controlled. "No," Linda replied. "We're clarifying it." The shift was complete. Not in a single moment, not with a dramatic confrontation, but through a series of quiet decisions that had gradually removed any illusion of balance. David had made his choices. Now he was facing them. Not through anger. Not through revenge in the way people imagine it. But through something far more effective. Accountability. When we left the office, he turned to me in the parking lot. "This isn't what you want," he said. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I answered. "Yes," I said quietly. "It is." Because in the end, this wasn't about destroying his life. It was about taking mine back. The house sounded different once the paperwork began. Not quieter, just clearer. Every room held its shape without the soft noise of assumption, without the small automatic adjustments I used to make to accommodate someone else's habits. Mornings were simpler. I made 1 cup of coffee, left. 1 light on, locked 1 door. It wasn't loneliness. It was precision. David moved out 2 weeks after the meeting with Linda. There was no scene, no shouting. We scheduled it like everything else had become time blocks, lists, signatures. He took what he needed. I kept what was mine. We stood in the same rooms we had once argued over paint colors and furniture placement, now discussing division with a tone that was almost courteous. Polite distance has a way of replacing intimacy when the latter becomes impossible. "I'll come back for the rest next weekend," he said at the door, his voice measured as if he were speaking to a colleague. "That's fine," I replied. He lingered for a second, looking past me into the house as if trying to find something he had misplaced. Or something he had never really understood. "Emily," he said, "we don't have to finalize everything this quickly." I held his gaze, not unkindly. "We're not rushing," I said. "We're being clear." He nodded, slowly absorbing that, then left. The door closed behind him, and for the first time in years, the silence that followed wasn't waiting for something. It simply existed. The legal process moved forward with a steady rhythm. Documents filed, disclosures exchanged, numbers reviewed and re-reviewed. Linda kept everything structured, efficient, unemotional. That mattered, because emotion complicates clarity. The financial picture, once fully laid out, was exactly what I had expected, and slightly worse than I had hoped. The separate account had grown faster than I realized, funded by transfers that, while not illegal, were certainly strategic. There were gifts, travel expenses, small but consistent withdrawals that added up to something significant. Not devastating, but deliberate. David didn't deny any of it once the documentation was complete. Denial requires uncertainty. And there was none left. "I wasn't trying to hide anything from you," he said during one of the final meetings, his tone quieter now, less defensive. I looked at him for a moment before answering. "You just didn't want me to see it," I said. He didn't respond, because the distinction didn't help him. I saw her once more, not by accident. Not exactly. It was late afternoon, a grocery store near my office, one of those large, brightly lit places where everyone moves quickly, focused on lists and routines. I was in the produce section when I noticed her at the end of the aisle examining a display of packaged salads. She looked the same, composed, intentional, unaware. For a moment I considered walking away. There was nothing to gain from the interaction, no information I needed, no outcome that would change anything already set in motion. But then she turned slightly and our eyes met. Recognition didn't come immediately. Why would it? I was just another person in a crowded store. Until I spoke. "Excuse me," I said, stepping closer. She looked up, polite but distant. "Yes. You were at the Hilton on Route 17, I said, keeping my voice even. "Last Thursday. The shift was instant, not dramatic, but unmistakable." "I think you have the wrong person," she replied, her tone tightening slightly. "I don't," I said. A pause, then calculation, because now she was deciding which version of this conversation she could manage. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "His name is David Carter," I continued. "He's my husband." There it was. The moment. Not explosive, not theatrical, just real. Her expression changed, not into guilt, not exactly, but into something more practical. Understanding. Distance. I didn't know, she said. I believed her. Not completely. But enough. "That doesn't change anything," I replied. "No," she agreed quietly. "It doesn't." We stood there for a moment, surrounded by ordinary life: shopping carts, overhead announcements, the hum of refrigeration units, two people connected briefly by a situation neither of us had created alone. "I'm sorry," she said finally. I nodded. "Take care of yourself," I replied. And then I walked away. Because closure doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from recognizing that the other person was never the center of the story. The divorce was finalized 3 months later. There were no surprises, no last-minute reversals. Everything unfolded exactly as it had been outlined: assets divided, accounts settled, obligations assigned. Fair. Not perfect, but fair. David tried once to reach out after it was done. A message. Simple. I never meant for it to